A dense fog rolled over London's West End, curling around the grand façade of the Cambridge Theatre, like a ghostly audience waiting in hushed anticipation. Inside, the final performance of the dying man's last act was underway, its lead, actor Henry Talbot, delivering his last monologue with the gravity of a man truly bidding farewell. The applause swelled as he clutched his chest and collapsed onto the stage, the perfect embodiment of a tragic end. But as the lights dimmed and the curtain fell, a horrified whisper swept through the wings. The applause had masked a truth more chilling than any script. Henry Talbot was dead. Inspector Japp arrived within the hour, his usual gruff demeanor strained by the baffling nature of the scene. Poirot, ever the observer, arrived shortly after, summoned by an urgent note from the theatre's owner. The great detective moved through the dimly lit corridors, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floorboards. The air smelled of old velvet, greasy paint, and something acrid, perhaps a touch of fear. The doctors say it was poison, Japp muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. Fast acting. But how? He drank nothing on stage, ate nothing. No needles, no marks. Poirot's keen eyes settled on the actor's body, still sprawled on the stage, as if waiting for his cue to rise. The expression frozen on Talbot's face was one of surprise rather than agony. "Non, mon ami," Poirot said, kneeling beside the corpse. This was not a simple poisoning. It was a performance of perfect illusion. The first clue lay in the actor's costume. His hand, which had clutched his chest so dramatically, had left a faint smudge of white on the black fabric. Poirot pinched a bit of the substance between his fingers, his expression unreadable. "Curious," he murmured. "This is not stage powder nor chalk. Tell me, Inspector, where are his personal belongings?" Japp gestured to a table in the dressing room, where Talbot's effects had been hastily gathered. A watch, a small flask of brandy, a pack of cigarettes. Poirot's fingers skimmed over them before stopping at a pair of gloves. He lifted them delicately, frowning at the interior lining. "Someone else wore these," he said. "And very recently," Japp scoffed. "A murderer who steals gloves? Hardly a master criminal, perhaps not," Poirot conceded. "But a master performer, oui." The theatre's cast and crew were assembled in the green room, their faces a collage of grief and apprehension. The lead actress, Evelyn Marsh, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her perfect features marred by genuine distress. "It was his final performance," she whispered. "He always said he would die on stage. But I never thought," her voice broke, "the monologue he performed," Poirot interjected gently. "Did he rehearse it exactly as he performed tonight?" A murmur of uncertainty passed through the group. "He changed a few words," said Richard Lawton, the understudy. "Added more weight to his final lines. It felt real to real. We thought it was just his brilliance as an actor." Poirot nodded, deep in thought. A poison that left no trace, a smudged hand, an altered performance. And yet, something was missing. He glanced around the room, his gaze pausing on the director, Leonard Wells, who had remained uncharacteristically silent. A man known for his perfectionism, his rigid control over every aspect of the play, Why would he allow an actor to alter his final words? Wells met Poirot's gaze with forced calm. Talbot was the finest actor of his generation. His instincts were impeccable, perhaps, Poirot mused. Or perhaps he knew something the rest of us did not. He turned abruptly and made his way back to the stage, eyes flickering over the floorboards, the wings, the rafters. Then, just as Japp puffed in exasperation, Poirot dropped to one knee, plucking something from the floorboards near where Talbot had fallen. A nearly invisible thread of white powder, precisely where Talbot had landed his final step. Poirot's voice was quiet but certain. The key, mon ami, is not what he ingested, but what he stepped upon. Poirot straightened, holding the faintly dusted fingertips up for Japp to see. The inspector squinted, then sighed. More powder? If you tell me he tripped on some toxic dust, Poirot, I might just walk out of this theater. Poirot merely smiled. Patience, mon ami. The theater is a place of illusion, of carefully constructed truths that hide deeper lies. Our poor Monsieur Talbot did not trip. He was directed, step by step, to his death. Japp grumbled, but waved over one of his officers to collect the sample. Poirot, however, was no longer watching. His gaze swept over the dim stage, searching for the next breadcrumb in the killer's carefully choreographed act. A subtle shift in the air drew his attention toward the wings. There, just beyond the velvet curtain, stood a lone figure, Evelyn Marsh. Her silhouette was rigid, her fingers tightly gripping her handkerchief. She was watching, but not the investigation. Her eyes were fixed on the stage, on the very spot where Talbot had fallen. Poirot approached gently, his voice barely a murmur. Mademoiselle, you are very close to Monsieur Talbot, n'est-ce pas? Evelyn startled, but recovered quickly, dabbing her eyes once more. Of course. We all were. Henry was. Brilliant, but tonight, something was different. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Poirot tilted his head. He changed his lines, did he not? Do you recall exactly how? Evelyn swallowed. Just small things. A different phrasing of his final words. She hesitated. But it felt like he was speaking to someone. Not to the audience, not to the script. To someone else. Poirot nodded, then gestured toward the edge of the stage. Would you indulge me, mademoiselle? If you were standing here, watching him perform, where was he looking? Evelyn blinked, thrown by the question. She turned toward the audience, mentally retracing the moment, then slowly, hesitantly, pointed not at the audience, but to the director's box above them, Poirot's. Mustache twitched. Japp, who had been listening, scoffed. Come on, Poirot. That's a coincidence. He was acting, not signaling a secret message, perhaps. But a man about to die often reaches for something real, Poirot murmured. He turned from Evelyn, making his way toward the director's box. Leonard Wells was already seated there, slumped in a velvet chair, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He didn't flinch as Poirot entered. You think I killed him? Poirot took a moment before answering. I think you knew something was wrong before anyone else did. Wells let out a slow, bitter chuckle. I direct actors. I see when a man is faking, and I see when he isn't. He flicked ash into a tray. Talbot wasn't acting in those last moments. I knew it, and I knew that whatever killed him had been waiting for him before he even stepped on that stage. Poirot's eyes glimmered. Before he stepped on stage, the words clicked into place, and suddenly the scattered pieces of the puzzle shifted. The powder on the stage, the gloves worn by someone else, the way Talbot's death was so perfectly timed, none of it was random. It was the result of precision, of control. And the person who had the most control over the performance? Poirot turned on his heel, walking swiftly down the grand staircase back toward the stage. His mind raced. There was one thing still unaccounted for, a misplaced object, an element that should not exist. And then, just as he stepped past the dressing rooms, he saw it, a pair of shoes, not just any shoes. Talbot's stage shoes, still neatly placed beside his dressing mirror. Yet Poirot had seen him wearing shoes when he died. The great detective knelt, studying the soles. Then he lifted them, weighed them in his hands, and smiled. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured to himself. The murderer did not just guide him to his death. They prepared him for it. Japp, who had finally caught up, threw his hands in the air. "Poirot, I swear," Poirot held up the shoes. "The answer, my friend, lies beneath our feet." Poirot turned the shoes over in his hands, his fingers running along the smooth leather before pausing at the soles. The edges were pristine, untouched by the dust and debris of the stage. A curious thing, if Henry Talbot had walked onto the stage wearing these, they should bear the scuff marks of his final performance. Instead, they were spotless, which meant, quite simply, that he had not been wearing them when he died. Japp, peering over Poirot's shoulder, frowned. "You think someone switched his shoes?" Poirot rose, placing the shoes carefully back where they had been left. "Not merely switched, mon ami. Consider, why would a man change into different shoes just before his most important performance? He would not. Unless, of course, someone else arranged it for him." Japp exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. "Right. That means we need to talk to whoever handled his costume tonight." "Wardrobe assistant?" Poirot shook his head. No. The wardrobe assistant provides costumes, but the actors prepare themselves. If someone changed his shoes, it was either done with his knowledge or without it. His sharp gaze drifted toward the cast and crew, still lingering in hushed conversation near the stage. Evelyn Marsh stood apart, arms crossed tightly as she stared at the darkened boards. Richard Lawton, the understudy, was speaking in a low voice to one of the stagehands. Leonard Wells sat in silence, finishing his cigarette. Poirot stepped forward. "Mes amis," he said gently, drawing their attention. "I must trouble you once more. Monsieur Talbot's death was no accident. You understand this, oui?" A ripple of unease passed through them. Lawton let out a nervous chuckle. "I mean, we assumed. But poison? How? You said yourself he didn't drink or eat anything." Poirot studied him. "Indeed. But consider this. His shoes were changed Lawton's smile faltered. His shoes. Evelyn's brow creased. That makes no sense. Why would someone? She trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. Poirot caught the hesitation immediately. Mademoiselle, you think of something. Evelyn hesitated, then sighed. It's just. Henry was particular about his shoes. He always wore the same pair for performances. He said they made him feel grounded. Poirot nodded. And yet, tonight, he did not wear them. Leonard Wells exhaled, his voice edged with impatience. What are you implying, Poirot? That someone forced him to change his shoes? The man was stubborn as an ox. No one made him do anything. Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. But consider what if he did not know he had changed them? Or, more importantly, what if he trusted the person who handed them to him? A long silence followed. Then Evelyn whispered, His dresser. Japp's eyes narrowed. His what? His personal dresser, Evelyn clarified. Henry didn't like anyone handling his costumes except for one person, Douglas Harper. He's worked with Henry for years. Japp gestured sharply to one of his officers. Find this Harper and bring him here. Poirot watched the ripple of tension that followed. Evelyn bit her lip, glancing at Lawton, who avoided her gaze. Wells drummed his fingers against his knee, his expression unreadable. Something was shifting beneath the surface, a discomfort beyond mere grief. Poirot turned his attention back to Lawton. Monsieur, you're Henry's understudy, n'est ce pas? Tell me if he had been unable to perform tonight, who would have taken his place? Lawton blinked, caught off guard. Well, me, obviously. But that doesn't mean pardon. Poirot interrupted. But I did not ask what it meant. I asked if you would have taken his place. Lawton's jaw tightened. Yes, but I had no reason to want Henry gone. Poirot's gaze did not waver. Did you? Before Lawton could answer, the arrival of Douglas Harper shattered the tension. The dresser was a weary man in his 50s, his hands still smudged with makeup powder. His face was pale, his movements stiff as he was ushered forward by the officer. I don't understand, he stammered. Inspector Japp, why am I being questioned? Poirot stepped closer, his tone light but firm. Monsieur Harper, you were responsible for Monsieur Talbot's wardrobe this evening, we? Harper nodded. Of course. As always, and did you prepare his shoes? Harper blinked rapidly. I helped him dress, yes, but the shoes, Monsieur Harper. Poirot's voice was silk over steel. Did you place them for him? Or did someone else? The dresser hesitated. It was brief, half a second, no. More, but Poirot caught it. Harper swallowed. I set them out. The ones he always wears, a single bead of sweat traced down his temple. Poirot tilted his head, and yet they remained untouched. Another pair was used. How do you explain this? Harper's breath hitched. He darted a glance toward Wells, toward Evelyn, even toward Lawton, as if searching for an escape. Poirot's voice softened. Monsieur Harper, if you're asked to switch them, it is best you say so now. Harper trembled. His lips parted, a confession on the tip of his tongue. But before he could speak, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Leave him alone, all." Eyes turned to Leonard Wells. The director rose from his chair, rolling his shoulders as if shedding a great weight. His gaze met Poirot's, tired yet resolute. "This isn't about Harper." He was just following instructions, Wells said, his voice calm but edged with something darker. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. "Whose instructions?" Wells exhaled. Then, in a voice that carried through the silent theater, he said, "Mine." A heavy silence settled over the theater, the kind that seemed to pull the air from the room. Poirot regarded Leonard Wells with a measured gaze, his expression unreadable. Japp stiffened beside him, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "Yours?" Wells exhaled, rubbing his temples before straightening. "I told Harper to set out the alternate shoes," Evelyn gasped. "You what?" "I didn't poison Henry," Wells said sharply, eyes flashing as he looked at her. "But I did swap the shoes. I had my reasons." Poirot folded his hands behind, his back tilting his head. "And those reasons, Monsieur Wells?" The director let out a low breath, glancing toward the empty stage as if searching for the right words. "Henry was difficult. More than difficult, he was a liability. He fought me on everything, ignored blocking notes, argued over the script. This play was my career, and he was tearing it apart." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "So, you sought control in the one place he would not notice." Wells nodded. "I knew he had this superstition about his shoes. I needed him unsettled, vulnerable. So I switched them." He hesitated. "I thought if he felt just the slightest bit off balance, he would follow my direction. That's all. I swear I had nothing to do with his death." Japp crossed his arms. "A convenient claim. And the poison, Wells? That just happened on its own." Wells' jaw tensed. "I didn't kill him." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Then tell me, Monsieur, who did?" The question lingered. Unanswered, Poirot turned away from Wells, his mind weaving through the threads of deception. Each person here had something to gain from Talbot's death, but no single motive fit perfectly. Evelyn Marsh had adored Henry, but love, when betrayed, could twist into something darker. Richard Lawton, the understudy, had everything to gain by stepping into the leading role. Leonard Wells needed control, but did he need Talbot gone? And then there was Douglas Harper the dresser, the man who had touched Talbot's costume last. A man who had seemed ready to confess something before Wells interrupted. Poirot studied him now, watching the way Harper's fingers twitched, the beads of sweat forming at his temple. "Monsieur Harper," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you did not act alone in this, did you?" Harper flinched. I don't. Did you poison him?" Poirot asked. Harper's eyes widened. No, I swear. I would never, but you knew something," Poirot murmured. "You were told to do something. Something you regret." Harper swallowed hard. His gaze darted around the room, then finally landed on Richard Lawton. The understudy stiffened, his hand clenching at his side. Poirot followed the silent exchange, his eyes sharpening. "Ah," he murmured. "There it is." Lawton's face paled. "What?" "No, you wanted the role, n'est ce pas?" Poirot pressed. "It was your chance. Your only chance." But Henry would never step aside. "You needed him out of the way." Lawton shook his head violently. "That's insane." Yes, I wanted the role. But murder? No, I didn't poison him." Poirot stepped closer. "Then tell me, what did you do?" Lawton hesitated. Poirot could see the war raging behind. His eyes, the desperate need to escape. But there was no escape from the truth. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lawton said, "I gave him the gloves." Japp's brow furrowed. "What gloves?" Lawton exhaled shakily. "He wore gloves in the final scene. It was part of the costume. But tonight someone gave me a different pair to give him." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Different how?" Lawton swallowed. "They looked the same, but the lining felt strange. Softer, almost damp." Poirot's breath hitched. "Damp." The missing piece clicked into place. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. Japp frowned. "What is it?" Poirot turned on his heel, sweeping back to the crime scene. He knelt, picking up one of Talbot's gloves where it had fallen. Carefully, he turned it inside out, revealing a faint crystalline residue along the inner lining. His fingers brushed against it, and he inhaled sharply oxalic acid. Japp's eyes widened. "Poison." Poirot nodded grimly. "A contact poison. It seeped through his skin. That is why there was no drink, no food. His death was worn, not consumed." He rose, fixing Lawton with a piercing gaze. "Who gave you the gloves?" Lawton shook his head. I don't know. I found them in my dressing room, right before the show. There was a note for Henry's costume. I thought," he faltered. "I thought it was from Harper." Harper's head jerked up. "I never left those gloves." Japp stepped in. "Then who did?" Silence. Poirot's gaze swept across the room. Evelyn was shaking. Wells looked exhausted. Harper wrung his hands. Lawton was pale, sweating, and then Poirot saw a flicker of something in Evelyn's eyes. Guilt, not fear. Guilt. Poirot's voice was quiet when he spoke. "Mademoiselle Marsh." Evelyn's breath caught. Poirot stepped toward her. "Did you love him?" Tears welled in her eyes. She let out a shaky laugh, one that was tinged with bitterness. "More than anything, and yet," Poirot said gently, "love can turn to hate, can it not?" Evelyn flinched. Poirot's voice remained soft, but unyielding. "You knew he was leaving you." She swallowed, blinking rapidly. I don't." Poirot did not relent. He was ending things. Perhaps not tonight, perhaps after the play, but soon. You saw it, didn't you? The way he changed, the way he looked at you less. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Poirot's voice was almost a whisper. "And so you left the gloves. The gloves that would take him away before he could take everything from you. A single broken sob escaped her lips. Poirot exhaled. You loved him too much to let him go. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. Then, finally, she whispered, Yes. Japp let out a low breath. God help you, Miss Marsh. Evelyn turned, looking at the stage one last time. The place where Henry had fallen, where her love had died. Poirot closed his eyes for a brief moment, then turned to Japp. It is over, Japp signaled his officers. As Evelyn was led away, the theater remained silent. A tragedy had played out here tonight, but the final act belonged to justice. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Come, Moan. Ah me. The curtain has fallen. As the police escorted Evelyn Marsh away, a hush settled over the theater. The final act had played out, and the curtain had fallen. Japp let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, that's that, he muttered. A crime of passion. Tragic, but straightforward in the end. Poirot did not answer. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the stage. Something gnawed at him, a faint discord, like a note played just out of tune. Japp clapped him on the shoulder. Good work as always, Poirot. You saw through her act when no one else did. He turned to his officers. Wrap it up, lads. We've got our killer. Poirot's mustache twitched. Have we, Chief Inspector? Japp frowned. What are you talking about? She confessed. Poirot, we. Poirot murmured. She confessed. Japp folded his arms. Then what's the problem? Poirot turned, looking at him. Does it not strike you as odd, mon ami, that Mademoiselle Marsh would use poison? Japp blinked. What do you mean? Poirot stepped lightly toward the fallen glove, still inside out on the floor. He gestured toward it. A woman in love, one, who acts in passion and heartbreak, does she not reach for the most immediate, the most violent means of revenge? A knife, a gun, even a push down the stairs? He exhaled, shaking his head. But poison, mon cher, that is the weapon of calculation, not passion. Japp hesitated. She had time to plan. Non, Poirot said softly. She did not, Japp frowned. She admitted to it, Poirot. Yes, Poirot said. And yet, she did not once say how she did it. She merely agreed when I spoke. His voice lowered. It was not a confession, mon ami. It was surrender. Japp narrowed his eyes. Then why would she lie? Poirot's gaze darkened. Because she believes she is protecting someone. Japp cursed under his breath. Then who the devil is she covering for? Poirot turned, his sharp eyes sweeping across the remaining faces. Wells, pale and shaken. Lawton, still rigid with tension. Harper, shifting uncomfortably. And then Poirot's gaze settled on a small, seemingly insignificant detail, something he had overlooked in the height of the drama, a coat. A coat draped over the back of a chair. Not just any coat, but one that had been resting in Evelyn's dressing room earlier that night. Poirot walked toward it, his fingers brushing over the fabric. There, just inside the pocket, a small, delicate trace of crystalline dust. He lifted his fingertips to the light. Japp peered closer. Is that? Poirot's voice was quiet. The same residue from the gloves. A long silence stretched between them. Poirot turned to the remaining witnesses, his voice gentle but firm. Mademoiselle Marsh did not retrieve the poisoned gloves herself. Someone left them for Richard Lawton to deliver. And that someone is still in this room. Lawton swallowed hard. I told you, I don't know who. Poirot raised a hand. None, Monsieur Lawton. You were merely a pawn. Japp took a step forward, his voice sharp. All right, then. Who's the real killer? Poirot let the silence linger, watching their faces. The answer was here, hovering just beyond his grasp, and then, like a whisper in the dark, it struck him, his gaze locked. On to Douglas Harper. The dresser stiffened. Poirot stepped forward, his voice like silk. Monsieur Harper, you were the last person to touch Henry Talbot's costume before he stepped onto that stage. Harper's lips parted. I was just doing my job. Poirot murmured. And that job included his gloves, did it not? A bead of sweat trickled down Harper's temple. Aye, Poirot did not stop. Evelyn Marsh believes she killed him because someone convinced her to leave the gloves. But she was merely another pawn, the real hand behind this crime was you. Harper let out a ragged breath. That's not true. Poirot tilted his head. Tell me, Monsieur Harper, why did you hesitate earlier? Why did you try to speak before Wells silenced you? You knew something, did you not? Harper shook his head violently. No, Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. Or did. You know everything? The silence that followed was deafening. Harper's hands trembled. Poirot's voice was soft. Murder is a performance, is it not? And every performance has its director. Harper's breath hitched. He took a step back, just one. But it was enough. Japp's hand flew to his holster. Don't move. Poirot's gaze never wavered. Monsieur Harper, you had access to Henry Talbot's costume. You had access to the gloves. You knew Evelyn Marsh would do anything for Henry, even something as simple as leaving behind a pair of gloves in a dressing room. You knew Lawton would obey any instruction given for Talbot's costume. Harper's voice was barely a whisper. You don't understand. Poirot took another step forward. Then help me, mon cher. Help me understand. Harper's shoulders shook. His eyes darted toward the stage, toward the very spot where Henry Talbot had fallen. And then, in a voice raw with emotion, he said, It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Poirot's breath stilled. You did not mean to kill him? Harper swallowed. I only wanted to make him sick. Just sick enough to miss a performance. Just one performance. His hands clenched at his sides. He ruined people, Poirot. He destroyed careers. He promised people things and then tossed them aside. I was just another one of them. Poirot nodded slowly. And you wanted revenge. Harper let out a hollow laugh. I wanted him to suffer, just enough to know what it felt like to lose something. But his voice cracked. I didn't think it would kill him. Poirot sighed. Oh, but murder. Monsieur does not listen to intention. Japp stepped in, snapping the cuffs around Harper's wrists. You're under arrest for the murder of Henry Talbot. Harper didn't fight. He only stared at the stage, his expression unreadable. Poirot exhaled, smoothing his coat. A false victory indeed, he murmured. Japp shot him a look. You always know when something's off, don't you? Poirot smiled faintly. It is my curse, Chief Inspector. The details there like whispers in the dark. And I always listen. The theater remained silent as Harper was led away. The true curtain had finally fallen. Poirot remained in the theater long after Harper had been taken away. The others had dispersed, the actors retreating to their dressing rooms, the stage hands whispering among themselves, Japp grumbling about paperwork as he left. The air still carried the scent of grease paint and old wood, the echoes of past performances. Clinging to the walls like ghosts, yet something lingered. Something unresolved. He stood at the edge of the stage, staring at the polished boards where Henry Talbot had fallen. His mind turned over the details like a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. The method, the players, the motives they aligned. Yet they did not. Harper had confessed, and yet there was a hollowness to it. He had wanted Talbot to suffer, yes. But Poirot could not shake the feeling that the true story had not yet been fully told. His gaze drifted to the audience seats, where Richard Lawton sat hunched over, his head in his hands. Poirot descended the stage steps and approached him quietly. You are troubled, monsieur. Lawton flinched, then sighed, rubbing his temples. It's over, isn't it? Harper's the killer. Poirot took a seat beside him. Perhaps. Lawton looked up, frowning. What do you mean, perhaps? Poirot folded his hands. Monsieur Harper did indeed lace the gloves with poison. That much is true. But tell me, if you wished to ensure someone suffered, would you not take precautions to avoid something so final as death? Lawton swallowed. I suppose so. Poirot nodded. Then why was the dose so high? Why was it lethal? Lawton had no answer. Poirot leaned back, his eyes scanning the theater. Tell me, mon cher, what do you know of Henry Talbot's past? Lawton hesitated. I know he was ruthless. He wasn't just an actor, he was a manipulator. He used people. He made promises he never kept. But that's the way of the industry, isn't it? Poirot studied him. Did he ever use you? Lawton let out a short, bitter laugh. Of course. He promised me leading roles, connections, opportunities. And when he got what he wanted, he discarded me. He looked down at his hands. But that wasn't just me. That was everyone. Poirot nodded slowly. And yet, some wounds cut deeper than others. Something flickered in Lawton's expression, uncertainty, or perhaps something darker. Poirot let the silence stretch. Before he continued, there is something you are not telling me, monsieur. Lawton tensed. A voice interrupted them from the shadows. He ruined a man once. Poirot turned. Wells stood at the edge of the seats, his face half lit. By the glow of the stage lamps, Poirot's voice was calm. Go on, monsieur. Wells exhaled, stepping forward. This was years ago. Before he was famous, before he had the power he wielded now, he hesitated, then sighed. There was an actor, James Forsyth. Talbot destroyed him. Poirot's brow lifted. How? Wells's jaw tightened. Forsyth was talented, too talented. Talbot saw him as a rival. And so he did what he did best. He played a role. He befriended Forsyth, gained his trust, then planted rumors. Lies about Forsyth stealing scripts about inappropriate behavior. Bit by bit, he poisoned Forsyth's reputation. By the time the truth was clear, it was too late. No theater would touch him. Poirot's voice was quiet. And what became of him? Wells looked away. He disappeared. Some say he left the country. Others say his voice faltered. Others say he ended his own life. A heavy silence settled between them. Poirot tapped his fingers against his armrest, the pieces beginning to align. A ruined man. A life destroyed. A past injustice echoing into the present. He turned back to Lawton. You knew this man, did you not? Lawton stiffened. I met him once. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Not just once. You knew him well. Lawton's throat bobbed. He stared at the floor. He was my uncle. Poirot let the revelation settle. Japp had believed the case to be simple. A crime of passion, then one of revenge. But this was deeper. This was something old, something buried. Poirot's voice was soft. Tell me, Monsieur Lawton, did you handle Henry Talbot's gloves before the performance? Lawton's breath caught. I don't know what you mean. Poirot's gaze did not waver. Did you, perhaps, handle them after Monsieur Harper? The silence was answer enough. Poirot nodded. The dose was too high. Far too high for a man who merely wished to make another suffer. His voice dropped to a whisper, but just high enough for a man who wished to avenge the dead. Lawton trembled. He took everything from my uncle, he whispered. Everything. And he never paid the price. His eyes burned. So I made sure he did. Poirot sighed, folding his hands. Ah, mon cher. Vengeance, it is a performance one never truly leaves. Lawton let out a shaking breath. Will you tell Japp? Poirot was silent for a long moment. Then softly, he said, Confess, and you may yet write the final act yourself. Lawton closed his eyes. And in that moment, the past finally caught. Up with the present, Poirot sat in quiet contemplation, his fingertips pressed together as he observed Lawton's slumped posture. The theater had grown silent, the scattered footsteps and hushed whispers of departing actors fading into nothingness. Only the distant hum of the city outside intruded upon the stillness. Lawton's confession, though unstated, lingered in the air like a specter. Poirot had heard the truth not in words, but in the slight tremor of the man's voice, the way his eyes darted toward the stage, as if haunted by the past. Yet Poirot knew that mere knowledge was not enough. The truth must be revealed in a manner that could not be refuted, a way that even Lawton himself could not deny. With measured patience, Poirot adjusted his cuffs and rose to his feet. Come, mon ami, he said to Lawton, his voice gentle yet firm. A walk will do us good. Lawton hesitated before nodding. They stepped out of the grand theater, the night air cool against their skin. Poirot led him along the quiet street, past dimly lit cafes and shuttered storefronts until they reached a narrow alley beside the theater. It was a forgotten passage, unused and unkempt. Where the smell of damp stone and old paper lingered, Poirot paused, his eyes glinting as he surveyed the shadows. "Tell me, Monsieur Lawton," he mused, "have you ever heard of L'arme du silence?" Lawton frowned, his breath uneven. "I know, a phrase I have coined myself," Poirot said with a small smile. "The weapon of silence." He turned, his gaze piercing. "You see, mon cher, in every crime, the guilty man fears noise accusation, discovery, the rattling of chains. But what he fears most of all is silence." Poirot stepped closer, his voice lowering. "For in silence he is left alone with his thoughts." With his guilt, Lawton stiffened. Poirot nodded. "A man who has committed a crime will fill the void with justifications, protests, distractions. But the moment he is faced with silence true, unbearable silence, his own mind will turn against him." Poirot let the words settle before continuing. "And so I propose a small experiment." He gestured to the alley, where an old wooden crate rested beneath a flickering street lamp. "Sit," Poirot instructed. "If you are innocent, you will remain still, unbothered. But if your hands have touched those gloves after Monsieur Harper's tampering," Poirot's gaze sharpened, "then silence will be your greatest adversary." Lawton's throat bobbed. "This is absurd." Poirot merely gestured again. For a long moment, Lawton hesitated. But then, perhaps fearing that refusal would be an admission of guilt, he stepped forward and sat on the crate. Poirot took a step, back folding his arms, and then he said nothing. Seconds stretched into minutes. The sounds of the street faded, the world seeming to shrink around them. Poirot watched, his eyes keen, as Lawton's fingers twitched against his knees. His foot tapped once, then stilled. His breathing became shallow, his jaw tightening. Poirot did not move. The silence deepened, wrapping around them like a shroud. Lawton's shoulders tensed, a muscle in his jaw ticking. Then, as if the weight of the quiet was crushing him, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "Damn you." Poirot tilted his head. "The silence, it unsettles you?" Lawton clenched his fists. "You already know, don't you?" His voice was low, strained. "You knew before we even left the theater." Poirot did not answer. Lawton let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. Yes. I touched the gloves after Harper. I increased the dose. Are you satisfied?" Poirot sighed. "I am never satisfied when a man chooses the path of vengeance, monsieur." Lawton pressed a hand over his face, his breath uneven. "I wanted him to suffer," he murmured. "I wanted him to know what it felt like to be powerless. But when I saw him on that stage, when I realized he was dying," his voice broke. "I knew I'd gone too far." Poirot placed a hand on his shoulder. "Justice, mon ami, is a precise thing. It cannot be meted out with passion alone, for passion blinds a man to reason." He sighed. "Come, let us return to the theater. We have much to discuss." Lawton hesitated before nodding. And as they walked back through the darkened streets, Poirot knew that the case was not yet closed. But the final act had begun as Poirot and Lawton entered the theater. The silence inside felt heavier than before, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the weight of a final truth. The stage, still dimly lit from the last rehearsal, stood eerily still, the very place where Victor St. Clare had taken his final breath. Japp was waiting in the wings, his arms folded, his usual gruff expression deepened by concern. "Had a feeling you weren't done," he muttered as Poirot approached. Poirot gave a slight nod. "Not quite, mon ami. There is still much to confirm." His gaze flickered to a stagehand nearby, who had been sweeping half-heartedly, as though afraid to disturb something unseen. Poirot's sharp eye caught a faint smear of dust near the spot where the fateful gloves had been left. "Tell me, Chief Inspector," Poirot said, adjusting his cuffs. "Where are the gloves now?" Japp frowned. "In evidence, of course. Locked up at Scotland Yard." Poirot's mustache twitched, an uneasy feeling curling in his chest. "Then let us waste no time." By the time they arrived at the evidence room, Poirot's unease had settled into certainty. The room was as it should be, shelves stacked with labeled boxes, the air thick with the scent of old paper and stored cases. But something was wrong. Poirot could feel it before Japp even opened the locker where the gloves had been secured. The box was there. The label in Japp's neat handwriting read Victor St. Clare Stage Gloves. But when Japp lifted the lid, his expression darkened. The gloves were gone. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Japp swore under his breath. "Impossible. Only a handful of people have access to this room." And yet, he raked a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Poirot's mind worked quickly, his little gray cells spinning into motion. The disappearance of the gloves was no accident. Someone had feared what they might reveal. Japp turned sharply. Whoever took them, they must have done it within the last few hours. He muttered something about checking the records, but Poirot was already stepping back, his thoughts racing through the events of the past day. Lawton had confessed to touching the gloves after Harper. That alone was damning, but not complete. Poirot had wanted the gloves tested again, had needed to confirm the precise traces of poison on them. And now, just as he was close to unmasking everything, they were gone. Someone was working against him. Japp barked orders to the officers nearby, demanding a full review of who had entered the evidence room. Poirot, however, remained still. He had solved too many cases to believe that mere paperwork would yield the culprit. No, whoever had stolen the gloves was cunning enough to cover their tracks. This was not an act of desperation, but of calculation. Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. If the gloves were taken, it meant only one thing. The real murderer feared what they would reveal, and yet Poirot had anticipated such a move. He allowed a small smile to cross his lips. "Chief Inspector," he murmured, "the criminal believes they have removed the final proof. But you see, I have anticipated this little game." Japp turned to him, eyebrows raised. "You knew this would happen?" Poirot gave a slight shrug. "I suspected," he admitted. "That is why I did something very important before leaving the theater." Japp looked skeptical, but Poirot merely gestured for him to follow. Come. Mon ami. We must return at once. The theater had emptied even further by the time they arrived, the heavy curtains casting long shadows across the stage. Poirot moved quickly, leading Japp to the dressing rooms. He stepped inside the very room where Victor Stiti. Claire had prepared for his final performance with careful precision. Poirot moved to the small vanity table where a delicate glass rested, beside a pile of scattered props. He picked up the glass and held it to the light. "Voile," he murmured. "The insurance policy of Hercule Poirot," Japp frowned. "A glass? What am I supposed to be seeing?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Not the glass, my friend. What is inside the glass?" A faint residue clung to the rim, a nearly invisible film, left behind by the last person to handle it. Poirot carefully set it down. "You see, mon cher Japp, I had an inkling that our culprit would try to erase the evidence. And so, before I departed, I ensured that we had a second source of proof. When I examined the gloves earlier, I made certain to check the surrounding objects as well. And this glass, it was handled by the same hand that tampered with the gloves." Japp's eyes widened. "Then we can test it?" Poirot smiled. "Indeed. And if my suspicions are correct, we shall find the same traces of the poison that was meant for Victor Stiti. Claire," he adjusted his cuffs. "The game, as they say, is nearing its final act." Yet Poirot knew that the missing gloves had changed everything. Someone had been bold enough to steal from Scotland Yard itself. And that meant the murderer was growing desperate. The question was, what would they do next? Even as Poirot allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at securing the glass as evidence, a growing unease stirred within him. The theft of the gloves had been bold, calculated the act of someone who still had something to protect. And if they had already risked so much, what was to stop them from going further? Japp, ever the man of action, was already barking orders to have the glass sent for testing. But Poirot barely heard him. His mind was moving rapidly, piecing together the next possible step. The true murderer was still playing their game, and that meant the thought was cut short by the sudden, sharp sound of footsteps rushing toward them. A young constable, breathless, skidded to a halt in the doorway. His face was pale, his voice slightly unsteady. "Inspector Japp, sir, it's happened again." For a brief second, silence filled the room. Japp straightened. "What do you mean?" Again, the constable swallowed. "Another body, sir." Back at the theater, Poirot felt a cold certainty settle over him. He had anticipated that the murderer would act again, but he had hoped just briefly that he would have more time. Without another word, they rushed back to the theater the moment Poirot stepped into the dimly lit backstage corridor. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Officers were gathered near one of the dressing rooms, their expressions grim. Poirot didn't need to ask whose room it was. Harper. A low murmur of voices rippled through the space as Japp pushed forward, but Poirot took in everything the way. The officers stood. How one of them had a hand pressed over his mouth, as though suppressing nausea. The body had not been removed yet. Poirot stepped inside. Harper lay slumped in the chair before his vanity, head tilted slightly to one side. His eyes, glassy and unseeing, stared at his own reflection. His mouth was slightly open, as if caught mid-word. But it was his hands that Poirot noted first resting motionless in his lap, with an unnatural stillness to them. Poirot exhaled slowly. The murderer had struck again. Japp swore under his breath. What the devil? Poirot moved forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. The faint smell of something chemical still lingered in the air, and there, on the vanity table, sat a half-drunk glass of wine. Poison, Poirot murmured. Japp's jaw tightened. Like St. Claire? Poirot's gaze remained locked on the glass. Non. This was different. Quicker, his fingers ghosted over the surface of the vanity. A thin layer of dust had been disturbed. Perhaps someone had moved something before. Leaving a quiet shuffle of feet behind them made Poirot turn. Lawton stood in the doorway, his face stricken. Is it true? His voice was barely a whisper. Harper. Poirot studied him carefully, noting the raw emotion in his expression. Lawton was a good actor, yes, but this moment, this grief was genuine. Japp exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. This changes everything. Poirot merely clasped his hands behind his back. Non, Chief Inspector. It changes nothing. Japp blinked. What? The murderer's hand has merely revealed itself in desperation. Poirot's gaze drifted back to Harper's body. And in doing so, they have told me exactly who they are. The theater was no longer just the stage of Victor St. Claire's final performance. It had become the setting of a far deadlier act, one that had yet to reach its final curtain. And now Poirot knew the murderer was closer than ever. Poirot stood motionless, his sharp gaze drifting across the room, absorbing the details with quiet intensity. Harper's death was not a distraction, it was a desperate act. The murderer had miscalculated. In their eagerness to silence the loose end, they had overlooked something crucial. A pattern had begun to emerge, delicate but undeniable. Japp, still staring at Harper's lifeless body, let out a frustrated sigh. We've got two dead men, Poirot, both poisoned, but in different ways. If this is the same killer, why change the method? Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. Because, mon ami, this was not part of the plan. The first murder, it was meticulous, carefully orchestrated. But this, he gestured to Harper. This was done in haste. Someone panicked. Japp's eyes narrowed. You think Harper knew something? Non. Poirot turned toward the vanity table, his fingers ghosting over the half-finished glass of wine. I think Harper said something. The distinction was important. Knowledge could be hidden, buried beneath layers of deception. But words could slip out unguarded. And the murderer had not been willing to take that risk. Poirot's gaze flicked to Lawton, still standing in the doorway, his face drawn with shock. He was muttering something under his breath, barely audible. Poirot's eyes sharpened. What was that, monsieur? Lawton startled slightly, as though he hadn't realized he had spoken aloud. Nothing. I was just thinking. He was afraid. Harper. After St. Claire died, he was different. Jumpy, afraid of what? Lawton swallowed. He never said. But he kept muttering about playing a part. I thought he was just being dramatic. He gave a humorless chuckle. Then his expression darkened. I suppose I was wrong. Poirot's mind moved swiftly. Playing a part. The phrase felt important. Was it metaphorical, or had Harper meant it quite literally? He turned back to the room, eyes scanning the space again, methodically. There on the dressing table, a faint smear of powder easily overlooked. Stage makeup. Harper had been wearing makeup before his death. But why? Poirot's breath caught for the briefest of moments as realization settled in. A role played off stage, a disguise that had not been meant for the audience's eyes. Harper had been hiding something. Or rather, someone else had been hiding behind Harper. Japp was watching him closely now. What is it, Poirot? Poirot straightened, his mind racing through the events of the past days, reordering them in a new light. Mon cher Japp, we have been looking at this crime from the wrong perspective. The question is not merely who had reason to kill Victor. St. Claire. It is who had reason to ensure that no one discovered the truth. Japp frowned. And that truth is... Poirot glanced once more at Harper's still form before turning toward the door. That we are dealing with a deception most grand. A role played so well, so convincingly, that even now we have not yet unmasked the true performer. Japp let out an exasperated breath. You're talking in circles again. Poirot. Merely smiled, his little gray cells alive with certainty. Not circles, my friend. Patterns. Poirot stepped away from the crime scene, his mind weaving together the strands of deception with practiced ease. The smudge of makeup, Harper's cryptic remark about playing a part, the sudden urgency in his murder, it all pointed to something far deeper than simple revenge or greed. This was not just about silencing a witness. It was about preserving a lie that had been in motion long before Victor St. Claire's death. As he descended the staircase, Japp hurried to keep pace. Poirot, if you've got something, now's the time to say it. We've got 2 men dead, and I don't plan on letting this lunatic strike again. Poirot smoothed the front of his jacket. Patience, mon ami. The pieces must be placed just so before the full picture can be seen. Japp groaned. You always say that. They returned to the drawing room where the cast and crew sat in tense silence. Lawton perched on the edge of a chair, his fingers drumming restlessly against his knee. Eleanor was withdrawn, her gaze unfocused. Carlyle, the director, sat stiff-backed, his eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating escape. Others merely avoided meeting Poirot's gaze. Poirot's eyes settled on Eleanor first. Mademoiselle, when last we spoke, you told me that Victor was a complicated man, that he made enemies easily. And yet, I do not think his murder was the result of an enemy's hatred. No, this crime, it is something altogether more insidious. Eleanor barely reacted. What are you saying? I am saying, mademoiselle, that this crime was never about Victor St. Claire. Poirot turned, scanning the faces before him. And that is where we have all been misled. The silence in the room thickened. Lawton's brow furrowed. That doesn't make sense. He was the one who was murdered. And yet, think on this, who was Victor St. Claire? Poirot spread his hands. An actor. A man who assumed many faces, many voices. And yet, was there ever a real Victor St. Claire? Japp blinked. Poirot, what the devil are you getting at? Poirot's sharp gaze landed on Carlyle, who shifted uncomfortably. Monsieur Carlyle, you worked with St. Claire before, did you not? Carlyle nodded. Years ago, yes. Tell me, when was the first time you met him? Carlyle hesitated, his jaw tightening. 15 years ago. And you, Mademoiselle Eleanor? Poirot turned to her. Eleanor's lips parted slightly. But no answer came. Poirot continued. You all assume that Victor St. Claire was merely his stage name. That beneath the performance there was a single man, his voice lowered. But what if Victor St. Claire was never one man at all. A stunned silence filled the room. Japp let out a sharp breath. You're saying what? That someone took his place? Poirot inclined his head. Not someone, mon cher. Someone's. The revelation settled over the room like a weight. Poirot paced slowly, his words deliberate. Consider, if you will, a man who disappears for long stretches between performances. A man who reinvents himself from role to role, never allowing anyone to know him beyond the stage. A man who, over the years, begins to look different, sound different because he is different. Poirot turned sharply. Victor St. Claire was not a single man. He was a creation, a persona inhabited by more than one individual over the years. And now someone was willing to kill to keep that secret buried. Carlyle's face had gone. Pale. That's impossible, is it? Poirot tilted his head. Or is it brilliant? A seamless transition, orchestrated when needed. One victor retires, another takes his place. Audiences notice a change in style, in voice, but nothing alarming, just the evolution of an artist. A name like St. Claire becomes a legacy, not an individual. Lawton exhaled sharply. You mean to say we never really knew who he was? Precisely. Poirot's voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of certainty. And I believe Harper discovered the truth. He learned that the man he had been acting beside was not the original Victor St. Claire, or even the second or third. He threatened to expose it. And for that, he was silenced. Japp folded his arms. All right, say I believe this wild theory. Who was playing the role this time? Poirot turned his gaze to Eleanor, who sat utterly still. That, mon ami, is the final mystery. A single tear traced down Eleanor's cheek. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was going to tell him. I swear I was. Poirot's expression softened. You knew, did you not? Eleanor closed her eyes. I loved him, the real him. But he told me once, Victor St. Claire is an illusion, my darling. He belongs to the stage, not to a single man. Her voice trembled. I never knew his real name. Poirot stood in the center of the dimly lit drawing room, his keen eyes studying every face before him. The air was thick with anticipation, fear pressing against the walls like an unseen force. No one spoke. No one moved. Every breath was a held secret, waiting to be exhaled. The truth had finally surfaced, but the game was not yet won. Japp shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Well, Poirot, if you've got something, now's the time to say it." Poirot steepled his fingers. "But of course, mon cher, the stage is set. The final act is upon us." His voice was measured, deliberate. "The man known as Victor St. Claire was never one man at all. A fabrication, played by different individuals over the years. A seamless illusion, passed from one to another like a mantle." He let the words settle before continuing. "But tonight, that illusion has been shattered. 2 men lie dead because someone was desperate to keep the truth from coming to light." Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed, her fingers twisting in her lap. Carlyle sat stiffly, his jaw locked. Lawton looked stunned, as if trying to reconcile the man he had known with the impossible truth Poirot had just revealed. Poirot let his gaze drift, searching for the crack in the façade. Then softly, he asked, "Tell me, Monsieur Carlyle, how long have you known?" Carlyle barely reacted. Only a slight twitch at his jaw. "Known what?" "That Victor St. Claire was not one man, but many." Poirot took a step forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "You have worked with him for years. Did you ever wonder how a man could change so completely between performances? How his habits would shift? His voice, his mannerisms?" Carlyle's lips thinned. "Actors reinvent themselves all the time." Poirot nodded. "But this was not reinvention, was it? This was something far greater. A deception so perfect, so seamless, that it fooled the world." His eyes sharpened. "And you were part of it." Carlyle's nostrils flared. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. Japp exhaled sharply. "Poirot, you're saying—" Poirot didn't take his eyes off Carlyle. "I am saying that he was not merely an accomplice to this grand illusion. He was the architect of it." Carlyle's hands curled into fists. "That's absurd, is it?" Poirot tilted his head. "You directed St. Claire's performances. You controlled when he appeared, where he traveled. You ensured that no one got too close, no one saw the cracks in the illusion." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "You were the puppeteer, Monsieur Carlyle, the mastermind behind it all." The silence was suffocating. Carlyle forced a laugh. "This is nonsense. You're grasping at shadows." Poirot shook his head. I am merely shedding light on them." He turned to Eleanor. "Mademoiselle, when you fell in love with Victor St. Claire, you did not fall in love with the man, did you? You fell in love with an idea, a performance." Eleanor's lip quivered. I thought I knew him." Carlyle's voice was sharper now. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof." Poirot said softly. "But I do." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a crumpled sheet of paper. "Harper knew the truth, and he tried to warn Victor." Poirot unfolded the note, reading aloud. "They'll kill you if you leave." He paused. He was not warning one man. He was warning the current, Victor St. Claire. Because Harper knew once you outlived your usefulness, you were replaced. Carlyle's composure fractured. "This is insane." Japp took a step forward, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "You should probably stop talking, mate." Carlyle ignored him. His breathing was shallow now, his eyes darting toward the door. Poirot took another step forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Monsieur, tell me what happened to the first Victor St. Claire?" Carlyle's mouth opened, then closed. Poirot nodded slowly. "That is what I thought." And then Carlyle moved. With a burst of sudden energy, he lunged, knocking over a chair in his path as he bolted toward the door. But Japp was faster. With a sharp, practiced movement, he grabbed Carlyle's arm and wrenched it behind his back, shoving him against the wall. The director let out a strangled sound, struggling. But Japp was unyielding. "Game's over." Japp growled. Carlyle's breaths came in ragged gasps. "You don't understand," he spat. "I created him." Poirot stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Non, monsieur. You destroyed him." The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Carlyle stopped struggling. The fight drained from his limbs. His head bowing forward, Japp gave Poirot a look. "I take it this means we've got our man?" Poirot sighed. "Yes, mon ami. His." Eyes lingered on Carlyle. "But the tragedy remains. The real Victor St. Claire was lost long ago, buried beneath the deception. And now, 2 men are dead because of it." Carlyle said nothing. Japp pulled out his cuffs. "Let's get you out of here." As he led Carlyle away, Poirot glanced at Eleanor one last time. She stared at the floor, lost in thought, the weight of the truth pressing down upon her. The illusion was shattered, and now the curtain had finally fallen. Poirot watched as Carlyle was led away, his head bowed, his resistance gone. The room, once charged with tension, now felt hollow, as though the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath too long. Japp let out a low whistle and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, that was a mess," he muttered. "But we got our man." Poirot did not respond. He remained motionless, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze distant. Japp frowned. "Come on, Poirot. You should be pleased. We've wrapped it up." Poirot blinked once, then twice. Slowly he turned his head toward Japp, his expression unreadable. "Non, mon ami," he said softly. "We have not wrapped it up. We have merely peeled back a layer." Japp groaned. "Oh, not this again." Poirot silenced him with a raised finger. "Tell me, mon cher Japp, what do you see when a man is caught in a trap?" Japp sighed. "Depends on the man." Poirot nodded. "Exactly." His voice dropped lower, each word deliberate. Carlyle did not fight to prove his innocence. He did not weep, nor beg, nor shout. He ran. Japp exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, that's what guilty men do. We." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Unless, of course, They are not the true mastermind. A chill settled over the room. Eleanor, still sitting stiffly in the chair, looked up, her face drawn. "What are you saying?" Poirot's gaze settled on her. "I am saying, mademoiselle, that something does not fit. Carlyle created the illusion of Victor St. Claire, oui, but he was a man of control, a director, a man who orchestrated from behind the scenes." Poirot's voice sharpened. "And yet 2 people died. That was not Carlyle's way. That was desperation." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Then someone else wanted them dead? Someone who was frightened. Someone who realized that the carefully constructed illusion was crumbling. Someone who needed to tie up loose ends." Poirot turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. "And yet, there is one question that remains unanswered." Japp raised an eyebrow. "Only one?" Poirot ignored him. "Why did Harper, a man who knew the truth, wait until now to act? Why did he write that warning? Why did he suddenly fear for Victor St. Claire's life?" He paused, then added, "And why was he murdered for it?" A heavy silence followed. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because someone knew he was getting too close." "Precisely." Poirot took a step forward, his voice growing sharper. "Harper was not afraid of Carlyle. No, he was afraid of someone else." His eyes locked onto Eleanor. "Someone much closer to Victor St. Claire." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. You think I, Poirot, did not blink? Non, mademoiselle. I do not think. I know." Japp stiffened. "Hang on, Poirot. She was the only one with true access." Poirot continued. "The only one who could whisper doubts into Victor's ear. The only one who could ensure Harper never revealed the truth." Eleanor shook her head violently. "No, that's not." Poirot cut her off. "You loved him, did you not?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. I did." Poirot's voice softened, but his gaze remained sharp. "But did he love you?" Eleanor's lower lip quivered. She turned her face away. Poirot sighed. "Ah," Japp, still struggling to catch up, shook his head. "Wait, are you saying she?" Poirot nodded. Harper saw it first. He saw the possessiveness in her eyes, the jealousy. And he knew when Victor decided to leave it all behind, when he tried to escape the illusion someone would not let him go. Eleanor's breathing grew uneven. "You don't understand." Poirot stepped forward. "Then help me understand." A beat of silence. Then a single tear slipped down her cheek. Her hands balled into fists, her entire body trembling. "He was supposed to stay," she whispered. Poirot said nothing. Eleanor swallowed hard. "He told me he loved me, that it was real." Her voice cracked. "And then one night, he told me he was leaving, that he couldn't do it any more, that he didn't love me, that he never had." Her expression twisted into something raw, something broken. "I gave him everything." Japp stared, mouth slightly open. "Bloody hell." Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "Harper knew. He warned Victor, but he didn't realize I had already made my choice." Her voice dropped to a whisper. I couldn't let him leave. Poirot closed his eyes for a brief moment. And so, you killed him. Tears spilled freely now. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to stop him. I wanted him to see what he was throwing away. She let out a strangled sob. But he wouldn't listen. He kept saying he had to go. Her shoulders shook. I didn't mean to, I swear, I didn't mean to. Poirot's voice was gentle. And Harper? Eleanor let out a soft, broken laugh. He figured it out. Said he was going to tell the police. I couldn't let that happen. Her fingers twisted together. I had already lost everything. I couldn't lose myself, too. Poirot exhaled, the weight of the confession pressing down on him. Japp shook his head, stepping forward. Eleanor St. Claire, I'm placing you under arrest for the murders of Victor St. Claire and James Harper. Eleanor did not resist. She simply closed her eyes as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Poirot watched as she was led away. Her head bowed. Japp let out a heavy sigh. Well, I'll be damned. He turned to Poirot. You knew, didn't you? Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Non, mon ami. I only suspected. He glanced toward the door where Eleanor had disappeared. Love, when twisted by obsession, is the most dangerous motive of all, Japp snorted. That and money. Poirot allowed himself a small smile. Yes, but money rarely weeps when the game is over. Japp shook his head. You know, one day, I'd like one of these cases to be simple. Poirot chuckled. Ah, but then, mon cher Japp, where would be the fun in that? As the rain drummed softly against the windows of Scotland Yard, Poirot sat quietly in Japp's office, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The case had unraveled. At last, the final confessions wrung from guilty lips. Eleanor St. Claire had been taken into custody, her face still streaked with tears, but the weight of the truth had settled over Poirot like an unfinished melody. Japp poured himself a drink, sighing as he leaned back against the desk. Well, that's that, he muttered, taking a slow sip. Case closed. Poirot's lips pressed together. Oui, mon ami. And yet, it does not feel quite so satisfying, does it? Japp frowned. Oh, come on, Poirot. We got the right person. She confessed. Harper saw too much. Victor wanted to leave, and Eleanor couldn't let him go. The evidence fits. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the swirling patterns of his untouched tea. It fits, he murmured, and yet something still eludes me, Japp scoffed. You just don't like loose ends. Poirot smiled faintly. Non, I do not. His fingers tapped against the tabletop. Tell me, mon cher Japp, why was Eleanor so quick to break? Why did she not resist? Japp shrugged. Guilt? She was exhausted. Poirot. The game was up. Poirot tilted his head. Perhaps his voice dropped lower. Or perhaps she was merely playing her final role. Japp set his glass down with a thud. Oh, for heaven's sake, Poirot. If she's not guilty, then who is? Poirot's gaze lifted, and his voice carried the weight of certainty. The one person who has remained in the background. The one who watched, who listened, who knew far more than he should have. Japp's brows furrowed. Who? Poirot leaned forward. What if Eleanor did not act alone? What if she was never meant to be the villain, but merely the shield? Japp's face twisted in confusion. You're not making sense, Poirot's voice grew sharper. Eleanor had motive, oui, but the method, the precision, the patience? His voice dropped to a whisper. She is an actress, Japp. And what is an actress without a director? A cold silence followed. Japp swallowed hard. You don't mean Poirot nodded. Carlyle. Japp stood abruptly, shaking his head. No, that doesn't work. Carlyle ran when we confronted him. He panicked. Poirot smiled sadly. We. And is that not strange? His voice was barely above a whisper. A man like Carlyle does not panic. The realization settled in the room like a lead weight. Japp turned away, muttering a curse. You think he played us? Poirot nodded. I believe Carlyle knew Eleanor was in love with Victor. He knew she would do anything for him. And I believe. Carlyle manipulated that love into something deadly. Japp let out a slow breath. But Eleanor confessed. Poirot's gaze darkened. Perhaps because she believed she was guilty, Japp's hands clenched into fists. You think Carlyle planned it this way? Let her take the fall. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. He is a master of illusions, mon ami. He creates stories. He directs performances. And what better way to disappear than to ensure all eyes are looking elsewhere? Japp turned. On his heel. We have to bring him back in. Poirot exhaled. I fear it is too late. Japp's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Poirot's voice was grave. Carlyle is gone. Japp rushed to his desk, flipping through reports, his fingers fumbling as he yanked open a file. But he stopped. His eyes locked onto the page. Slowly, his face drained of color. No, Poirot did not need to look. He already knew what the report would say. Carlyle had escaped, gone without a trace. Japp cursed, slamming the file shut. That snake. He turned to Poirot. How did we miss it? Poirot let out a slow breath. Because we were meant to. Japp ran a hand down his face. So what now? The real killer just walks free? Poirot shook his head. Non. He is free for now. But men like Carlyle, they cannot resist the stage. He will return in time. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. And when he does, I will be waiting. Poirot stood at the threshold of Scotland Yard, his silhouette framed against the dim glow of the street lamps. The rain had softened to a fine mist, curling in ghostly tendrils around his shoes. Japp was still inside, barking orders, sending telegrams, pulling every string he could to intercept Carlyle before he disappeared completely. But Poirot knew better. Carlyle was a man who understood how to vanish. The night stretched before him, but Poirot did not move. His mind sifted through every detail, every conversation, every glance exchanged between the players in this carefully constructed tragedy. Eleanor's tearful confession, Victor's final plea, Carlyle's carefully orchestrated retreat. It had been a performance from the very beginning, and Poirot had been one step behind. Just as Carlyle had intended, a gust of wind rattled a discarded newspaper along the pavement, the headlines a stark contrast to the reality of the case. Theater Murder Solved Street. Claire in custody. Poirot bent down, lifting the paper with delicate fingers. The ink was still wet, the certainty of the words almost mocking. He traced them thoughtfully, his lips pressing into a thin line. The world believed the story was over, that justice had been served. But he knew better. As he turned to go, his eyes caught on a small card tucked into the folds of his coat. It hadn't been there before. Poirot stilled, his fingers closing over the fine edges. He pulled it free, tilting it toward the lamplight. A single word was scrawled in elegant, practiced handwriting. Bravo! Poirot's breath remained steady, but his pulse quickened ever so slightly. His fingers tightened around the card as he examined it closely. No signature. No return address. Only that single word taunting him. He had underestimated Carlyle. For a moment, he simply stood there, the rain whispering against his hat, the city breathing around him. He could turn back, alert chap, raise the alarm. But to what end? Carlyle was a master at controlling the narrative, and he had already rewritten this one to his advantage. Poirot slid the card into his pocket and turned down the street, walking. With slow, measured steps, the case was over, but the mystery was not.